So hopefully you can see the screen. Could somebody just confirm that you're seeing that?
I can see that.
Yeah, it's clearly visible. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so my topic today is broadly about why we might want to think about supporting and revitalizing endangered languages, and a little bit about some of the ways that we can try to do that. So I'm going to share my slides with you via the website that was mentioned earlier, and this will be available later today for you to freely download and use for educational purposes. A lot of the work I'm going to talk about today was done in collaboration with my former SOAS colleague, Julia Salabank, and I want to thank her, but also point out that whatever I say today is my view, and Julia may not necessarily agree with all of the details. So what I'm going to do is give some commentary and a background about the notion of supporting and revitalizing languages based on literature research, but also as mentioned earlier, my first-hand work with a number of groups in Australia. I've worked on about 12 languages there. Sadly, today, all of those languages are what we call moribund, which means they have no or very, very few fluent speakers. The other place I have worked is in Eastern Indonesia. And here what we have is very vibrant, dynamic languages. So the Sasak language spoken on Lombok, for example, has 3 million speakers, but they are in a weak socio-cultural position, heavily dominated by the national language. And I'll try and present to you some theoretical and practical suggestions about ways in which we could develop policies and actions for supporting languages and cultures. And I'll try and spell this out at several levels. The individual level for individual people, at a family level, and also at group levels. And I think it's important to distinguish those and see in what ways we can have initiatives or actions. So first I'll talk a little bit about linguistic diversity around the world, some threats to that diversity, the notion of language shift and what it is and what causes it, and ways in which we might think about what has been called reversing language shift, that is pushing back against processes that I'll identify earlier. And then what some of the implications are of this for support for languages and cultures. Asking questions like, what can people, individuals and families do? What can communities do? So the Naga communities as a group. What researchers, people who are trained in things like anthropology or linguistics or education, what can they do? What can groups and institutions do? So things like government organizations, schools. And so we'll look at those 4 different kinds of levels, and then I'll try and draw some conclusions towards the end. Now, before we start talking about language diversity, it's really important to remember that the whole issue of language and dialect is a very complicated one, and there is really no easy way to distinguish, what is a dialect, what is a language? Is this a dialect of a certain Naga language, or is it a separate language itself? This is really a complicated issue. And in some regions of the world, we have very unreliable data about local language situations. And this is particularly true in South Asia, including India. So earlier, some figures, population figures were mentioned, but notice they were based on a census that was done 10 years ago. So already we have 10 years of change that has potentially affected notions of language and how many people and so on. The Society for Endangered and Lesser Known Languages has a number of talks on this issue of India, the situation in India, and I would encourage you to have a look on YouTube, the talks by Professor Arbi and Professor Mishra. Now, there is an international survey which tries to come up with some figures about diversity. It's called Ethnologue, and it's available online. You can look up the information there. And what they tell us is that there is 7,097 languages spoken on Earth today. So the actual size of populations is very hard to calculate for the reasons I mentioned earlier and the lack of good census data. And it varies wildly. So some languages have a billion speakers, and some have just one speaker, one single individual. So the Diari language, which I'll mention later in my talk, we have today just one old lady who is a fluent speaker of that language. If we look at the rankings, the languages, the largest languages in the world, which have hundreds of millions of speakers, I've just chosen the top 6. And you can see here that already 2 of those are spoken in India. So Hindi Urdu is the 2nd biggest language in the world, and Bengali is the 6th biggest. So we see that there are a small number of extremely large languages and a large number of small languages, including the various Naga languages, Kuki-Chin, and other Tibeto-Burman languages. The distribution around the world is also not uniform, and what we find is that Africa and Asia have the vast bulk. 2/3 of the world's languages are spoken in Africa and Asia. So the rest of the world is actually a much smaller proportion of the diversity. So the area where we're looking at in terms of India is one of the richest in terms of linguistic and cultural diversity. For Northeast India, in fact, the UNESCO International Organization has identified quite a number of languages which are endangered. And I'll come back to what we mean by endangered in a few moments, but basically that we're looking at dozens and dozens of languages that are really threatened and may have difficulty in terms of future, passing them on to future generations. Now, these figures are probably highly inaccurate simply because the data that we have and the data that UNESCO uses is not really reliable for not only this area, but other places in the world. Now, one of the approaches that have been taken looking at diversity globally is the notion of language hotspots. So researchers at the Living Tongues Institute have identified areas of the world in which there is lots of linguistic, cultural, and social diversity. And in those places, that diversity is threatened in the sense that people are switching away from their traditional languages and switching to other more dominant languages. And you can see here that Eastern India and neighboring areas into Malaysia is one of the world's language hotspots. So the region of Northeast India is right at the center of one of the hotspots of language diversity. Now, when we start looking at going beyond just languages, we can actually start looking at speaker communities. And here we can develop a classification of different communities. And there are a number of factors involved. The first is what is called intergenerational language transmission. And this is whether children are learning the same language that their parents speak. So is the language being passed on to children? The second factor is the percentage of speakers in the total population. So not quoting absolute numbers, not saying, well, we have 1 lakh of speakers or 2 lakhs of people, but actually what proportion of those people are actively using the language. The third factor is the domains and functions of the languages that are actually used. So where are they used and what are they being used for? So in some communities, we find that particular languages are only ever used in the house for talking about everyday, activities at home, and never used more broadly within the society. So we can look at those domains and how the languages are functioning. A fourth and really important factor is the language attitudes and ideologies of the wider community. We find for many minority groups, smaller groups, they are surrounded by larger communities, and we have to think about what is the attitude of that larger community? Do they recognize and give status to those people? So we heard earlier, for example, it was only in 2003 that the Pumai Nagas were actually recognized and given a status. The fifth factor is the ideologies and attitudes that people have towards their own language and culture. So are they proud of it? Do they demonstrate it? Is it something that they highly value, or do they feel shameful? Do they say, well, we shouldn't be speaking that, it's backwards or negatively valued? Now, there are more complicated ways of looking at these things. So UNESCO has, I think, a dozen factors or so, and there are other ones. But I think these 5 are the most fundamental. And they give us a way of classifying different language situations. Here, now, it's important to emphasize here, we're not talking about languages, but we're talking about situations or contexts of language in use. So viable, safe, or strong languages spoken by all groups, learnt by children, and actively supported, positively valued by the communities. An endangered language is one which is socially and economically disadvantaged, under pressure from a larger local or regional or national language, and there's a reducing population. And without doing something, without some kind of community support, that language will potentially disappear. Moribund languages are not being learnt by children anymore. They usually have only a few old speakers, and maybe those people use them occasionally when they meet, but there's no general social function. And very sadly, this is the case with about 95% of Australian Aboriginal languages. Very few speakers and only old people using them. And finally, we have extinct languages, these which have no speakers. Maybe people know a few words, or they maybe have been written down, but today nobody actively speaks them. So we take the 5 factors, and we are then able to categorize language contexts or situations into these different types. And there have been efforts around the world to map the different kinds of situations that we find. And you can see there are these kind of global maps. UNESCO has been involved in this. If we zoom into Northeast India, the area where we're focusing on today, you can see the yellow dots are endangered languages and the red dots are highly endangered, critically endangered languages. So you can see many, many, many languages spoken in these areas, and many of them are under threat. Now, there are problems with this kind of approach, and I'll just very quickly mention this counting tends to be done at the level of languages rather than really where it should focus, which is on communities, families, and subgroups. It ignores the dynamics of linguistic ecologies and doesn't really take account of the change that's often happening. And it assumes a level of homogeneity. So what happens in one village may not be the same as what is happening in a neighboring village, even for the same language and cultural group. It commodifies languages and turns them into objects or dots, but they actually are intricate socio-cultural phenomena that involve human interaction. They're not things or objects. So what we need to do is to understand local ecologies, local linguistic and cultural ecologies, and what the processes and causes of change are, especially the sort of processes that are called language shift. So language shift refers to the fact that we see languages going out of use. And some of these have come about, some of this loss of languages has come about through disease, genocide, and actual loss of population. But more generally, what we see, and particularly the last 40 years of history, is radical reduction in speaker numbers all around the world, often in one or two generations, and with younger generations shifting to dominant languages with more economic, social, and political power. This results in age profiles for communities shifting so that only older people are using it, and there's a lack of transmission. And the American linguist Michael Krauss argued that this will result in the loss of 90% of the world's languages in the 21st century. The less extreme estimates in most of the literature suggest it's about 50%, which is still a huge number of threatened languages and cultures around the world. And the Endangered Languages Project in Hawaii estimates that we lose at least one language every few months. So there's a worldwide pattern of languages going from safe to endangered to moribund to extinct. And this can happen quite rapidly. Within a couple of generations, we can see this kind of shift and change taking place. It's been going on for a long period of time, so we have historical evidence that it's been happening for thousands of years, but the last couple of hundred years, and especially the last 65 to 70 years, this whole process has speeded up. And some of the causes are colonialism, the rise of what we call hegemonic nation states. So these are national entities that have a monolingual ideology. So, to be one nation, we must have one language, and they promote that, and resulting in shift and loss. Migration is also an important factor, urbanization, communities moving from village situations into cities, and the spread of global languages and cultures. The causes, what are the reasons this happens? Well, one is demographic. Intermarriage between different groups can result in languages not being passed to children. Family structure changes, so moving from a communal family organization to much more kind of parent and children isolated families, drops in population, people moving to other places. Socioeconomic factors include things like changes in lifestyle, employment, migrating for work, the spread of education and government services, medical and other services. There are political factors, so pressure to adopt national or local languages and conform to the resulting cultural expectations. And this is often supported by political institutions like education, the media, and service delivery. So things like, as I said earlier, medical services and central government provision. So those are the first three important factors: demography, socioeconomics, and politics. But another factor, and one which is probably even more significant, is attitudes. So the internal attitudes within the minority group and the external attitudes of the majority or the regional or national governments. And these can be, if these are positive, they can lead to maintenance and a continuation of languages and cultures, and negative attitudes can lead to a shift within a particular community. Now, externally, negative attitudes can also support that shift, or in some cases result in reaction and pushing back against the outer larger community. Very frequently, like what we have here in the UK, is a kind of it's your problem attitude. So the larger community doesn't care. And it says to minority groups, to people who have migrated to the UK, if you want to keep your language going, that's your problem. We won't do anything to help you. Okay, the fifth factor, and which is also an important one, is ideologies and beliefs. And Julia and I have written some about this. So this is the idea that there are sets of patterns of values and ideals that are shared by a given group of people. So these are not individual, but rather sort of shared patterns. And they are socio-culturally motivated views about how language works and also how particular languages operate. So they are socially constructed and shared, usually unconsciously accepted and not questioned at all. And speakers are often unaware that they have these views, but they drive, these ideologies drive the way that they behave. And they're based on deep-seated perceptions about what do people do, on what they believe that they actually do on the one hand, and language policies, which is what should we be doing. So we might well say, well, we should be speaking our own language at home, but the actual practice is that they don't. So you have a disjunction between the practices, which is part of driven by the ideology on the one hand, and the policies of what people think they should do on the other hand. And so what are some kind of examples, some instances? So an ideology might be that language is changing and it's getting worse from generation to generation. So, children speak much worse than their parents do, and language is getting bad. People who can't read or write are ignorant and stupid. So, the word illiterate often means stupid. It doesn't mean not just unable to write. Some communities, people will say, we can't write our language. Our language has no writing. It's too, too backwards or too difficult to put it down in writing. In India, we often hear that Sanskrit is an ancient and pure language. And that's a kind of ideology of belief about how things are. Among the Tibetans, they believe that every valley has a river and every village has a dialect. So their view of their ideology is that diversity and difference is normal and very common. Another common ideology, you have to learn proper English in order to get ahead in the world. So what are some of the responses? How could we kind of respond to the fact that we have this language shift going on, driven by those different factors that I mentioned earlier? Well, one possibility is to encourage that shift. Simply stop speaking your ancestral language and adopt the ideology, the view that this is the dominant language, it's better for my children to learn it, they'll get ahead, they'll get a proper job, they'll be educated. So actively encourage shift. Another attitude is to be apathetic and say, I don't care. Well, I don't care what happens. You know, I want a good future for my children, but if they speak their language, oh, so what? I don't speak it, but, you know, when I go outside, I hear people speaking it, so somebody must be speaking it. The third attitude is to reject any personal responsibility and to hand over the responsibility to organizations and schools. So you might have a positive view and say, well, we should keep speaking Naga, we should keep Naga going, but the schools have to look after that, or the local community organizations. So individuals don't take any responsibility, they hand that over for somebody else. Okay, another possible response is to take responsibility and decide to do something positive in your own family. And this involves developing what I'll show you later, but it's called a family language policy, having a policy that you'll use language in different ways within your own family. Another possible approach is to take an active role in promoting the language and culture locally and in wider situations. So such a person might be called a language activist. You know, they're known for being positive and supporting and wanting the language to continue and to deal with language shift. And at a broader level, one can also organize and create structures to support the language and the culture. So not just, you know, speak about it and say we should do something, but actually organize and create. So all of these are possible responses, and within a given community, you will find different people adopting these different ways of dealing with it. So some people will want to give up on the language, and some people don't care, and others will want to take a more active role. And these are choices that individuals and groups can make. So why should we do something? Why not just let languages disappear? Well, there are a number of reasons. And we see these reasons coming out in different groups and communities around the world. So maintaining the language, keeping it going, having children acquire it, allows for a connection to the ancestors, to the history of the group, and to its cultural heritage. And this, in many, many situations, it has a very positive impact on people's identity. When people are, when the world is changing, when there's all sorts of developments happening, it's very easy for groups to lose a sense of their own identity, their own history, and where they are. And keeping the language and culture going can be very helpful in that process. We've also seen in many communities that language support and maintenance has a very positive benefit with helping to deal with personal and historical trauma, with the kinds of negative experiences that people have gone through. Maybe they were beaten as children because they spoke their language, and they were forced to change to something else. Well, dealing with that, healing from that, can happen through language support. We can see building and strengthening the community, so developing common goals and language and cultural support can be part of strengthening communities, bringing people together in a common goal. Can also be really valuable in terms of developing knowledge and understanding of the culture. We find in many communities that ecological knowledge of the environment, plants, animals, medicines, and traditions can be developed and enhanced by supporting the maintenance of language and culture and passing this knowledge to the next generations. Outside of language and culture and history, there's lots of evidence coming up from different places in the world that being positive about your language and culture and history has a very positive impact on your physical and mental health. We find that things like youth suicide, the number of young people who commit suicide, very sadly, a major problem in many Indigenous communities in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, and other places. By developing language and culture awareness and support and understanding, we find that connected to the notion of identity, we find that this has big impacts on the mental health and reductions in things like youth suicide, for example. There are also huge benefits that have been demonstrated in psychology and education through adopting the mother tongue in education and supporting multilingualism. So rather than saying, oh, everybody should speak the one big dominant language, actually speaking multiple languages has very strong cognitive, psycholinguistic, psychological benefits to children and young adults. There's increasing evidence that having a firm grip on the language of your family and your home can serve as a solid basis for adding other languages and for developing strong intercultural communication skills. So there's been research in Thailand, for example, which shows that developing literacy in your first language, the language of the home, actually serves as a basis for having stronger literacy skills in the dominant language, in Thai in this case. So minorities who have positive attitudes and support their local languages actually do better in school in the second language, in the dominant language of Thai. So there's lots of reasons for wanting to take a more active position rather than a passive one, or one that promotes language shift. So what can we do if we decide that we want to do something, that we make a choice? Well, individuals and parent families can begin by early on, if possible, even before children are born, to develop a family language plan, to make decisions about which languages will be used and which languages are going to be the language of the home and which ones will be used outside. They may decide that they want to speak the languages and pass them on to the culture. And sometimes what we find within families is that the children will actually understand the broader social dynamics and they will reply in the dominant or more powerful language. And parents, if they wish to maintain and pass on their language and culture, need to be strong and persistent and simply to continue speaking that language at home so that the children are exposed to it. A common situation we find in many communities is mixed marriages, where mother and father come from different groups, often speaking different languages. Well, a policy that seems to be very powerful and to get very positive results is what's called the one parent, one language policy. So here, under this approach, father would speak to the children in his language and mother would speak to the children in her language. And the result will be that the children will grow up actually speaking both languages, being multilingual. So rather than saying, oh, well, we should, use some other language or we should just choose one, the one parent, one language policy actually is a positive way of supporting multilingualism and the maintenance and continuation of languages and cultures. We need to realize that children are experts at learning languages. They can grow up speaking 2 or 3 or more languages, and the dominant ones which may be necessary for the modern world, they can be learned outside the house, at the school, in play groups, in different institutions, or with their friends. So having a domain, a location, a place functions for the language, say in the house, doesn't mean that the children will not learn fluently the larger dominant language. So one ideology, which I mentioned earlier, is the notion that, well, if we stop speaking our own language and we speak the dominant one, whether it's English or Hindi or Spanish, that will be better for education, better for the children. That's simply not true. Children can become fluent speakers of multiple languages. What about at the group level? Well, it's really important to think about collecting information about local language situations, what's called the language ecology. So working out who speaks what to who do they speak to, when do they use which language, where and why. And often this kind of local information is simply not available. It won't be available to individuals or families, and it will require a group-based approach to sort of survey and look at what the factors are. Explore the particular factors that affect language shift and maintenance, especially the attitudes and ideologies which can be invisible to people, to individuals, and understanding them requires some research and looking across a whole group. Thinking about ways in which we might address underlying issues, not just language issues, but social, political, economic, health, welfare, and social justice issues that lead to language shift. So can we, for example, develop local economic activity that means people don't have to leave the village and therefore move to the city and therefore stop speaking their own languages? It's also, groups can also share information with others, let people know what's happening in different communities and learn from one another and share stories. Very, very frequently we find that particular groups may not realize that what's happening in their community is also happening in lots of other communities around the world. And we can learn a lot from each other, and not just only within the region or within the country like India, but also internationally. Other things we can do is to bring the language out of the home to be part of a wider community use. And this sometimes this is called the language landscape. So bringing the language out into the language landscape. A common approach is to put up signs, make signs in multiple languages, make the languages visible to support them, create contexts where the languages can be used, such as festivals, performances, spaces for interaction, social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. These are all great places to create context for language use. And I want to emphasize it's really important not to focus too heavily on the past and kind of hyper traditionalize the language. You know, we find in quite a number of areas that older people will say, "Oh, back in the good old days when the language was, you know, wonderful and strong." And this kind of approach, if it emphasizes too much on history in the past, will actually turn younger people off, and they'll come to the view that the language can't be used for modern activities, for you know, different things that they're keen and interested in. So here's some signage from Canada where you can see we've got English, French, and the Cree language written in their own script. One of the groups I work with in Western Australia has been putting signs up around their area, and they've been displaying the language along with the English signs there. So this is a bilingual community in Western Australia, and they're actively bringing bilingual language into the language landscape. putting up posters, information. This one is again from Western Australia, and the nice thing is this one, it has recordings for the local languages actually in the sign. So when you touch the sign, it will play sound from the local language. This is an example of a workshop I ran a couple of years ago, bringing different generations of people. This is the Diari group, and we have 5 generations. They're brought together, engaging in activities, having fun, and just creating context for the language to be brought out of the home. Another thing that we have done is to develop songs. The community were particularly keen to have the use of the language for singing, not traditional songs, but actually modern songs. And we workshopped and worked together to create new songs in a style that everybody likes. So they like a kind of style called country and Western music. And what they wanted to do was to express their identity there and who they are in a modern way using the language. So I'm not sure if this will play for us, but I'll just give you an example of one of the songs that we developed. Sorry, I knew this would happen. Let's try this. Try again. Okay, so hopefully you're still with me. So that was just an example of bringing the language out of the home into a situation, working together, and coming up with something that the community could enjoy. This process that we're on the verge of here is called language revitalization. Policies and actions taken to increase the number of speakers and the domains or contexts where languages are used. And there are several different approaches that we see around the world. One of these is called language nest, and this is an approach that's been promoted initially by Maori people in New Zealand, but adopted all around the world. And here what you have is a play group or a preschool program where grandparents and grandchildren are brought together. And the rule is you must only speak the local language in the play group so that the little children, the little babies, are growing up being exposed to the local language. So developing a nest of speakers by bringing the 2 generations together, the older and younger generations. Another approach is that used by, in the United States, it's called Master Apprentice Program, and that is where you team up experts in language and culture with younger people, and they kind of learn from them by actively doing and following the master. A third possibility is small group interactions around tasks with a common goal. So things like the workshop that I mentioned earlier with the Diari people in Australia, promoting some intergenerational exchange by working on a common goal. In our case, it was developing some songs. Another common approach is to take children off to have camps or holidays together and have fun and speak the language and engage in fun activities. Developing informal language and culture lessons, maybe doing things when people are on holidays or on weekends, or they're not, and during times when they're not so busy. And finally, we have formal language lessons. So this is using the language in education. And again, there are different approaches here. You can have language as a subject, which very often only means a few minutes or hours a week where there's a very limited exposure. This typically is not terribly effective in revitalizing. Bilingual education, which is teaching in 2 languages, usually a transition model where there's more exposure to the smaller minority language at the younger age and gradually shifting into the more dominant use of the larger language. And the third possibility is immersion education, where all of the education is taught in the minority language. So this includes the teaching of content, things like mathematics, science, history, all being taught in the language itself. Now, obviously, that's a huge investment of time and energy and effort, and the need to train teachers and so on. And only a few situations is that possible. One, for us in the UK, Wales is an example of that, where Welsh has been gaining speakers by immersion education. Now, to do this kind of work, we need documentation and description of languages, development of orthographies and spelling. Linguists and other researchers can help by bringing their specialist knowledge and collaborating with local teachers, community members, and cultural experts. And children can be also very much involved in the educational side by helping to develop materials in their classrooms. And it's really important to emphasize here that adults have to be part of the revitalization process. A mistake that some communities make is to put all the responsibility onto the children. They are the ones who are supposed to, deal with language shift. Well, this is not going to work because it requires an engagement and involvement from adults as well. I'll skip over this one. Let me just quickly mention here. So it's important to think about the linguistic ideologies which are adopted in education and language revitalization. And there are lots of dominant or Western ideologies like needing a standardization, a standard language, fixed spelling, that show bringing these in can actually result in negative outcomes. They can influence the expectations and assumptions about what the kind of goals are that are achievable. So the idea, well, we want our kids to be fluent speakers of the language. Well, some communities realize that this is actually not an immediately achievable goal. And an example of this is the Gumlarai community in New South Wales, Australia, that I've worked with. There haven't been any fluent speakers of this language for about 50 years, but we've got quite a lot of documentation, recordings and written material. And linguists and schools might think about making dictionaries and textbooks and focusing on children. This is what sort of experts might say, we want the kids to be learning it in school, but in fact, this is only part of the answer. If we look at what the ideology of the community is, their view is that the language is sleeping, and they see the major use of it as symbolic representations. So being able to say certain fixed expressions to welcome people to a place is the major function that they see as being important for their language. Not using it every day, not speaking it on necessarily on a common basis, but bringing it out and showing it as a sort of fixed thing. So even in international meetings, there's an example here from a delegate to an international meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, and she began her speech by speaking in the Gamilaroi language. Quite simple, simply saying, I'm Gamilaroi, I'm from Australia, and so on. So for them, revitalization is in a broader ideology of a politics of resistance to past injustices against Indigenous people in Australia, as well as reconciliation between minorities and majority communities. And the goals, therefore, have to be tailored to the local community ideologies and looking for achievable goals. Not discouraging people by saying, well, you all have to be speaking this language all the time. That's simply not possible in this context. So what can we achieve and how can we achieve it? And in fact, in the Australian case, there are major outcomes which are not linguistic outcomes, but they relate to improvements in social well-being, self-esteem, confidence. So they had a big problem with children not wanting to go to school, the so-called truancy from school. Kids just simply wouldn't go to school. They hated it. And by bringing the language and culture into the school and opening up opportunities to positively value it, the result is that they have now children want to go to school. They want to be engaged. And as I mentioned earlier, this whole process can deal with the trauma of the past. And the communities were extremely badly treated. Indigenous communities were extremely badly treated in Australian history, and supporting the languages and cultures now, not with the goal of everybody speaking them all the time, is a way to deal with this past, terrible past history. Okay, so let me head towards finishing up, and I want to point to you a really useful resource that I think may be valuable for some of you. This is a book that was just published in the last month called Revitalising Endangered Languages, a Practical Guide. Now, this book was published by Cambridge University Press, but it is completely free, open access, and anybody can download it from the internet. The link is here, but if you search for Revitalising Endangered Languages, a Practical Guide, you will be able to get access to this. And it gives you all of the background, the different, and it's very practical. So what are the ways to develop programs? What are the different possibilities? How can a language nest work? How can we have informal activities? What are the more formal educational side, and so on? So please have a look at that, and the link will be in the slide, which I'll put up on my website, or maybe somebody can copy this, or I will put it I'll put this link into the chat when we finish up. So in conclusion, the world is globally connected, and no country can escape linguistic and cultural issues, and everywhere we must deal with the rights and issues and cultural heritage. No country or region can adopt a monocultural ideology. It's simply too expensive from a political, social, and economic and human point of view. To understand what's going on locally in individual villages, families, communities, we must understand attitudes, beliefs, and ideologies about how do people value language, how do they use it, how does it function. And responding to shift and loss involves individuals, involves families, groups, organizations, and institutions. And final sort of emphasis is do not rely on school as the place to support and revitalize languages. If you want to support your local language, that needs to be embedded in the daily lives of people, in the locations, in the language landscapes, in the activities that are meaningful to people, and not think that our school will save our language. We need better training and understanding, lots more cooperation and collaboration, and particularly intercultural communication. Training and understanding the sociopolitics of language. Most researchers and most linguists simply don't understand these broader, more complex issues. And we need better training in ethical, moral, and social justice. And my final point is that local, regional, and globally, there are opportunities to contribute to continuing the richness of the world's heritage and opening up avenues for increased respect for minority and endangered languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Austin. That was a very insightful lecture.